Welcome to Surrender School. This is the science of Step 1.
And today's session is going to be on stress and the stress hormone cortisol and how it affects us in our disease. So let me start with, my normal caveats and disclaimers. I am not a medical doctor, scientist, or expert in the science of obesity and addiction. I am not saying that my way is the right way or best way to approach abstinence and food plans. And always, always, always check with your doctor before doing anything different with your food plan. All right, so let's recap last week. We talked about the neurotransmitter dopamine and the reward circuitry in the brain as a way of explaining the mental obsession part of our disease. We have the physical allergy, we have the mental obsession. We learned about how our brains have been hijacked by our modern food environment. We also learned how our brains think about and make decisions about food, and that these decisions are made with the non-conscious parts of our brain. And I theorized that this might be the location or the mechanism of our strange mental blank spot that the big book talks about. All right. So now I love this picture. So now we're going to talk about stress as another aspect of our mental obsession. So obviously, stress makes us overeat. We all know that because we've all experienced it hundreds of times. And it is well documented in the scientific literature that both animals and humans increase their food intake following stress or negative emotion. And we overeat whether we are hungry or not. But why? So let's back up for a second. What is stress? Essentially, at its most basic, stress is a challenge, physical, emotional, or psychological. There's good stress called eustress, like getting a promotion, getting married, or winning the lottery. Then there's bad stress, and we're all familiar with that. And this is the kind of stress that's perceived as a threat. Either we won't get something we want or need, or something we already have will be taken away from us. So bad stress is a threat. Stress responses are deeply wired into the many systems of our brains. Scientists call this the threat response system because it involves multiple parts of the brain. Its purpose was to keep us alive, like everything that evolved in our system. So its purpose was to ensure our survival. So how is it supposed to work? Okay, here's our handy dandy brain. When you experience stress or perceive a threat, your body interprets and processes the threat in an area of the brain called the amygdala. It's this little bulb down here, okay? And it touches all kinds of different parts of the brain. It's connected to them. So the range of the amygdala's connection with different parts of the brain goes anywhere from the lizard brain, the brain stem down here, all the way up to our thinking, reasoning, conscious brain up here in the prefrontal cortex. So it's connected to everything, which makes sense because it's important for survival. Now, it worked quite well for the kinds of short-term acute stressors our ancestors faced, like fighting off an animal or fighting off a rival band of hunter-gatherers. So it worked well obviously for the survival of our species because we're all here. So once the amygdala perceives a threat, then what happens? The amygdala turns on two other systems. First, the stress hormone cortisol is released. And second, the amygdala activates the sympathetic nervous system. That's the system that allows for activity for us. Both cortisol and the sympathetic nervous system raise blood sugar levels and blood pressure. And it does this so that it gets the muscles ready for fight or flight. And this is done by providing them with extra fuel by raising the blood glucose level and by providing more oxygenated blood through increased blood pressure. Both of these reactions are supposed to shut off just as soon as the stress threat response has passed. One of the scientists that I read, I think it was Robert Lustig, he talked about it like this. He said, I escaped the lion. Excellent. Time for a nap. So it was, we're confronted with the stress, we have our stress response, the stress is resolved or we're killed, and then it comes back down again. That's the way it's supposed to work. So all you need to know about the threat response system is our experience of stress is interpreted and processed by a part of the brain called the amygdala. This is an old, primitive system that was crucial for the survival of our species. And we know whenever anything is old and primitive, it's non-conscious. The amygdala causes the stress hormone cortisol to be released, and it activates the sympathetic nervous system, which is the physical action, take action system in our bodies. But we don't live the same way our hunter-gatherers ancestors lived, okay? So now most of us live in long-term chronic stressful situations, and we perceive threats coming from all around us. Things like our job, our spouse, our kids, the 24-hour news cycle, our finances, social media, technology, and on and on and on. And when we live in these long-term chronic stress situations, our bodies and our brains unleash a long-term cortisol cascade. They just keep pumping out cortisol. And our cortisol becomes unregulated and it doesn't turn off. Now, science doesn't know why or how this happens, but they do know that it does happen. And this constant flood of cortisol is a vicious cycle. More stress equals more cortisol. More cortisol equals the stress, the experience of stress, more of the experience of stress. So cortisol, stress, stress, more cortisol, and around and around and around. And it just doesn't stop. Now, this prolonged and near constant stress response damages our bodies and our brains, and the consequences continue long after the stress and threatening experiences stop. Unlike the way it's supposed to operate, the way it operated in the hunter-gatherer time of human beings. It's important to know that there are individual differences in stress responses. We don't all respond the same way. I'm going to talk about what I consider the three most important individual differences in stress responses. The first one is genetic. The second one is perceptual differences, differences in how we perceive the world around us. And then the third one is having a history of childhood abuse or trauma. So I'm going to talk about those three one at a time. So first, there are genetic variations in cortisol secretion. Some people just secrete more cortisol than other people do. And I wonder if this might be another way that we are bodily and mentally different from our fellows, like the big book talks about. that we are more hyper-responsive. We have a more hyper-responsive stress response. Another individual difference is how we perceive stress. And this is really, really, really important because this is actually something we can do something about. We can't do anything about genetic differences that we have, but we actually can work with and manage our perception of stress. And our perception plays an important and critical role in the secretion of cortisol. And it's particularly around the issue of control. So if you feel like it's a stressful situation, yes, but you have at least some amount of control in the situation, you will have less of a stress response. If you feel like you have zero control over the stressful situation you're in, you are going to have more of a stress response, and you're going to excrete or secrete more cortisol in response to it. So, in other words, do you believe that there is something you can do to help yourself, or do you feel completely victimized by your situation? The stress that we feel we can't do anything about has a particularly potent cortisol raising effect. I will tell you that step work and emotional sobriety work has been really critical for me in this area. And we're going to talk a little bit more in detail about that later on today. The last difference I'm going to talk about is having a history of childhood abuse or trauma. And I want to go into a little bit of detail here. There is a famous study that was started in the mid-1990s by the Centers for Disease Control and Kaiser Permanente. The study is called the Adverse Childhood Events Study, or the ACEs study for short. It is one of the largest investigations to date of childhood abuse and neglect and their connection to later life health and well-being. Now, there are 13,000 subjects in this study, and they are still collecting data on these subjects. So this study looked at 7 kinds of adverse childhood experiences: psychological abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, violence against the mother, or, kids witnessing domestic violence against the mother, living with substance abusers, someone in the household is abusing substances, living with someone who is mentally ill, and living with family members who had been imprisoned or incarcerated. So those were the 7 stressors that they looked at. Now, this study is really important to us as compulsive overeaters and food addicts because adverse childhood experiences increase our risk for addiction, physical inactivity, and obesity. Now, I can understand addiction. I can even understand obesity a little bit, but physical inactivity, the fact that we are couch potatoes, that we tend to exercise less than others, that's really interesting to me. Now, the chronic stress response alters a child's development. So when traumatic exposure occurs during critical periods of childhood development, all those different milestones that you talk about in the pediatrician's office. There are critical periods of development for children and adolescents. And if this traumatic exposure occurs during these critical periods, then the very core of the child's being is altered. Now, children survive abuse by accommodating to it. We figure out how to survive the situation by fitting ourselves to it. And this often leads to feelings of fear, distrust, shame, defeat, and resignation, victimhood, helplessness. These feelings shape our self-concept. We fail to learn things like emotional self-regulation, how to handle and cope with our emotions. And I will tell you, I only had one coping strategy, and it was eating. That was all I had. I didn't know any other way to regulate and cope with my own emotions. Folks who've also have histories of abuse and trauma fail to develop a sense of control over their lives. Again, it's that victimhood stance. And we also don't develop the ability to process and integrate information properly. So to me, this means a lot of the emotional sobriety stuff that we talk about. So we don't take in information properly. We think everything is about us. We think the world centers around us. We think we have the ability to make someone drink or make someone be physically abusive, or we are at fault for the abuse. We don't take in what's going on in the situation appropriately. We blame ourselves instead of blaming the abuser. So we aren't looking at things. We aren't making proper attributions for behavior. That's very interesting. The authors of this study asked if we might need to reconceptualize the obesity and addiction epidemics as having their origins in untreated trauma. Now, I don't know about that, because 100% of people that are food addicts or compulsive overeaters don't have any kind of history of abuse or trauma in their childhoods. Now, many of us do. So that's why I wanted to talk about it, because it makes us uniquely susceptible to obesity, inactivity, and addiction. But not all of us have this history. But I do believe that it is an important piece of the puzzle for many of us. And I know that it was an important piece of my own addiction puzzle and was important for my own recovery. So all you need to know about the individual differences in stress responses is that there's a genetic component to the amount of cortisol people secrete in response to stress, that people perceive and interpret stressors differently, and that this affects how their threat response system works. And a history of childhood trauma significantly affects how people experience stress. So that's all you need to know about individual differences in stress responses. Are there any questions in the threat response system or individual differences in how people respond to stress?
Actually, the question, yes, there is only one question. What would you say is the main difference between feeling powerlessness, and victimization?
Awesome.
Excellent question.
Awesome question. Victimization leaves you in a place where you can do nothing. You just sit back and you let everything wash over you. Powerlessness, for me, is the recognition that there are some things I cannot control, and that I am responsible for doing what it takes to deal with that or navigate that. That's what the whole 12-step system and my higher power are there to help me to do, is to do what I need to do to navigate my powerlessness over my alcoholic foods. So one recognizes that we don't have control over everything, but we're not helpless. And victimhood says we're powerless over absolutely everything, and there isn't a damn thing we're going to do about it. We are helpless. To me, that's what those differences are. And that's a really big difference in stress response. If you feel like you have something you can do, like get a sponsor, work the steps, follow a food plan, put down your alcoholic foods, and develop a connection with a higher power, that's a lot of things to do in response to the powerlessness over our alcoholic foods. But if you are victimized by your addiction, if you feel you are a victim of your addiction, then there's nothing for you to do, and you're powerless, and it's futile anyway. And why am I sitting here right now in this workshop? Because there's nothing for me to do. Those are how I see the difference. I hope that helps.
There's one other question, if you want to take one more question.
Sure.
It is, what happens when you have more than one stressor? Like many of us have more than one stressor.
It compounds. It compounds the situation. You know, like, have you ever had that experience where it's like you're being stressed, one stressor after another, and then finally there's this straw that breaks the camel's back, and you fall down in a heap. I have had that happen to me in my life, where the number of stressors were simply more than my brain and body and spirit could tolerate. And, fortunately, I had other people in my life that could help me, and I was able to get professional help and to figure out how to navigate all that stuff. But I was overwhelmed by my own ability. And sometimes in program, we have to go and get outside help in addition to working a program. There are times when that's absolutely necessary. But I think that's one of the qualities of the long-term chronic stressors that we now have, is that there isn't just one. You're not just facing down a bear attack, and which is one stressor, it's right in front of you and you know exactly what you're dealing with. We have stressors that are from multiple different areas in our lives, and we don't oftentimes know what we're really even dealing with. And part of the stress is the unknown factors in it. So I think it's additive.
Thank you, Linda. There are several more questions that have come up, but we can continue if you'd like. One was just about, is trauma the same response as abuse? But we can continue if you'd like, and I can ask that at the end.
Okay. All right. So, there was that. Okay. So how does stress affect my obesity, my food addiction, and my behavior? So first, let's take a look at how stress, and more specifically cortisol, affects us with regard to food. So first, cortisol increases blood sugar, which increases insulin secretion, which increases fat storage. This means that high cortisol levels contribute to our insulin resistance. We know that insulin is the fat storage hormone. I've said it a million times in this workshop so far. But cortisol doesn't just pack the fat on anywhere. It specifically directs fat storage around our organs. This is what's called visceral fat, and it is dangerous for our health. This kind of fat is associated with cardiovascular disease, metabolic syndrome, which includes diabetes, hypertension, and abnormal cholesterol levels. So insulin makes you store the fat, and cortisol tells your body where to store it. Now, it's important to know that this actually had an adaptive feature for hunter-gatherers, okay, for our ancestors, because visceral fat is stored, or excuse me, visceral fat is metabolized much more quickly than the subcutaneous fat, our love handles or our muffin tops or whatever you want to call them, the stuff you can pinch. It is metabolized more quickly and can be used more quickly in a time of crisis. And that's why when we're under stress, the body tells you to store that excess fuel in case we need it in a place where we can get to it really fast. The problem is that we don't live like that anymore. And that's why it's so dangerous for our health. That's also why people who aren't fat can get type 2 diabetes and can have, heart attacks and strokes and things like that. That's why thin people can have insulin resistance. You don't have to be fat to be insulin resistant. And it's because of this mechanism. Well, this is one of the reasons for that mechanism. Okay, next. Cortisol leads to excessive food intake, particularly comfort foods. We all know that. We all lived it, been there, got the t-shirt, got all the fat that was involved with it. We are not eating extra broccoli. We go straight for comfort foods. The brain's preferred drug of choice to self-medicate stress is sugar. And here's why. And this blew me away when I learned this. The brain chemical rewards we get from the kinds of foods that actually lessen stress by changing how our amygdala processes stress-related information. I'm going to say that again because it really blew me away. The brain chemical rewards we get from our binge foods, our alcoholic foods, actually lessen stress by changing the way our amygdala processes stress-related information. Binge food literally makes stressful or threatening things feel less stressful and threatening. The brain reward chemicals that we get from our binge foods directly oppose the activation of the threat response system. I'm going to say that again. The brain reward chemicals, the effect that we get from our binge foods directly oppose the activation of the threat response system. We eat that crap because it works, at least temporarily, to make us feel better or at least to feel less bad. But this is an important one. We only overeat when high-calorie binge food is around us. If we are surrounded by celery, we are not going to overeat and binge on celery because it doesn't help. Only binge food does. So if we're surrounded by binge food, then we will overeat and binge. This is yet another reason why it's important to keep junk food out of sight, the need to minimize environmental food cues. The magic formula for stress overeating is the combination of chronic, uncontrollable stress plus the availability of high-calorie comfort food. That's going to equal stress eating every time. Now, cortisol and related compounds cause leptin resistance in the hypothalamus. And we know what happens with leptin resistance. It makes us feel like we're starving. We also know that insulin resistance and leptin resistance interfere with our lipostat, And remember, the lipostat is that fat setting on our body. Now, as if that weren't bad enough, cortisol and related compounds also increase our levels of neuropeptide Y. And remember, neuropeptide Y promotes hunger and massive overeating. Now, all of this makes evolutionary sense, okay? If we're going to be under stress, we need to have energy, we need to have fuel. And so doing all of this, making us leptin resistant, making sure that our lipostat is raised so that we eat more, so that we can store this visceral fat. So we're going to have energy for this crisis that we're living through, right? So all of it makes sense. But again, it never stops for us because it's long-term chronic stress. But you see, our response, the amygdala doesn't really know the difference between short-term acute stress like our ancestors had and long-term chronic stress that we have now. Its response to stress is its response to stress. It doesn't determine whether it's short or long-term. Now, cortisol also breaks down our system of feel-good chemicals. Cortisol messes with something called our endocannabinoid system. This system does a lot throughout the body, but for our purposes, it affects our emotional well-being. For example, the secretion of a neurotransmitter in the endocannabinoid system called anandamide is decreased by the secretion of cortisol. And anandamide is a neurotransmitter that stimulates a sense of happiness and a sense of well-being. In fact, its nickname is the bliss molecule. Now, if you are wondering, because of that little thing in there, cannabin, in the endocannabinoid system, yes, this is the receptors that marijuana hooks into. And that's why we get that happy, funny, in a good mood feeling from smoking marijuana. It's because it affects that cannabinoid system. But cortisol makes it harder for us to experience a sense of well-being from this normal endocannabinoid system. I'm not talking about illicit drugs, drugs now. I'm talking about what it would be doing normally in our body. It blocks those effects. It wants you to pay attention. And if you're off having a good time and feeling pretty darn good about yourself, you're not focused on the threat in front of you. So it wants to shut it down. So not only do we have the negative feelings from the stress itself, cortisol blocks important feel-good chemicals in our brains. So it's like a double whammy. Cortisol and chronic stress also kill off prefrontal cortex neurons. Now remember, the prefrontal cortex is the rational, conscious thinking part of our brains. This thinning out of our prefrontal cortex neurons has been found to be an important predictor of relapse for addicts. Why? Because loss of these neurons decreases our ability to reason. Our rational decision-making takes a hit. We don't have as much conscious control over our behavior. So how does this work? Say we are under chronic high levels of stress and we are confronted with a box of donuts at work. Now, the loss of some of my prefrontal cortex neurons means that I won't think of the other things I can do in response to my stress and the donuts. Things like pray, call my sponsor, go read something spiritual, take a minute to meditate for 2 minutes in the bathroom. None of that's going to come up for me. All I'm going to do is eat the donuts. Now, obese people overall have been shown to have a thinning of our prefrontal cortexes anyway, and this indicates the loss of those kinds of neurons. I think this is very unfair, but this is what the science tells us. Let's get down to the nitty-gritty here. What in the world are we going to do about this? So, two areas that were the most important for me in managing stress and handling stress were perception and control. Genetics, I can't do anything about. My history of abuse, I did some professional therapy on that, but I also worked my program in emotional sobriety on it. And I'll talk about that in a minute. So what I did is I worked to change my perceptions of life and my feelings of control in life. There were three things that helped me with these changes: intensive step work, emotional sobriety work, and relationship work with my higher power. And like I said, I also obtained therapy for my childhood trauma. So let's start with intensive step work. Steps 1 through 9 taught me so much about how I perceived the world. I saw everything as being about me. I believed I was the center of the universe. And the big book talks about this particular misperception a lot. On page 62, quote, selfishness, self-centeredness, that we think is the root of our troubles. Further down on page 62, so our troubles, we think, are basically of our own making. They arise out of ourselves, and the alcoholic is an extreme example of self-will run riot, though he usually doesn't think so. Above everything, we alcoholics must be rid of this selfishness. We must, or it kills us. Now, I used to interpret these lines as a kind of moral instruction. Good girls aren't selfish. Selfishness is sinful. But this isn't how I interpret them anymore. It is much more practical than that. Our selfishness leads us to perceptual errors. We see things as a threat when they really aren't. Making everything about me causes me to make things mean more than they do. The steps help me correct my distortions and misperceptions about life and my place in it. Step 1 taught me that I have nothing to do with the fact that I have this disease. This disease isn't about me personally at all. It is not a personal failure of mine. Can you see how selfish and self-centered it is to think we are the cause of our disease? Our culture may try to tell us we're the cause, but the big book and the science clearly tell us that we are not. My belief that I was to blame for my disease is a misperception of reality. Now, step 2 taught me to accept reality as it is and step into its power, and that is how I am restored to sanity. I align myself with reality, and that allows me to access the power of it. I don't expect my higher power to change reality. I expect myself to accept, work with, and cooperate with the reality of how my body and brain work. And my higher power helps me do that, because by myself, I cannot fight my way out of a wet perceptual paper bag. I need my higher power to help me with this. When I do that, I am restored to sanity around food. Step 3. I used to interpret this step as making God responsible for me and that nothing bad could happen to me. It was a complete abdication of personal responsibility. Now I see step 3 as taking the responsibility of running my thoughts and actions by my higher power all day long. I ask for guidance on my thoughts and actions and emotions and everything else all day long. Step 4 taught me about the misuse of my will. It taught me how thinking I am the center of the universe and that everything is about me gets me into trouble. This is where I start to take a really good look at how my addict distortions and misperceptions play out in my life. Step 5 is a magical process where I learn about my patterns of thinking and behavior that get me into trouble and ultimately lead me back into my disease. And it's also where I gain a tremendous amount of humility, not humiliation, but humility in learning that I am just part of the human race. We all do crazy crap like we talk about in our 5th steps with our sponsors. We all do it. And as we go through it, our sponsors let us know, oh crap, yeah, I did that too. We are part of the human race. We all do it. And to me, this was a very magical process. I mean, I'm not the only one that acted insanely like that. It was wonderful. I felt like I belonged. Step 6, my selfish interpretation of this step was that God was going to do all the work. Now I see this step as continuing to dig deeper into my distortions and misperceptions. I began to really see the connection between how I was perceiving and interpreting the world around me and how I was feeling inside. This is where my character defects came from. So, for example, my distorted belief in my own self-importance led me to believe that I knew what everyone else should do. This led to my character defect of telling people what they should do, giving unsolicited advice, being critical, or feeling superior because somebody else did something. I giggle at that crap now. Okay, I have no idea what to do for myself, not to mention anybody else. Anybody else. Step 7 was another chance to offload personal responsibility because God's going to do it all. God's going to remove all these defects for me. Now I see step 7 as an invitation to really start to dig into the work of personal transformation. I ask my higher power for guidance on each and every one of my character defects and what actions to take to begin to remove them. Then I act on that guidance. For me, this is the proper use of my will. I don't do this to make my life better, although it does make my life better. It has made my life incredibly better. I do this so I can be of maximum use to my higher power and the fellows about me. That's why I do this work. And step 7 is a beautiful reminder of that for me. Step 8, now I used to barely pay any attention to this step at all. But now, for me, this step is all about forgiveness. I had to stop selfishly nursing the harms people on my list had done to me. I had to stop making it all about me and start seeing the other person's point of view. And I'll give you an example. My sister died a few years ago, and when she was moved into hospice, she wanted me to come out there and be with her. She lived lives in Michigan. I live in Arizona. That was about 2,500 miles away. Okay. It was at the beginning of the pandemic. They were still figuring out even what was going on when this was happening. But my sister needed me and I wanted to go out there and help her. So I slathered myself in hand sanitizer and all the masks and everything, goggles and everything else I could get my hands on, and boarded a little metal tube in the middle of a pandemic and went to Michigan. Within 36 hours, she threw me out of her apartment and told me to go home. Well, needless to say, this showed up on the next 4th step inventory I did on my resentment list. And it wasn't until I got to step 8 where I realized what it was really about. And it was where I was trying to focus on her and not, the harms that I perceived she had done me by throwing me out of her apartment. What it was I had to forgive her for not seeing herself as a victim, because I came in like Mighty Mouse coming in to save the day. I was going to take care of this poor victim who was dying, and I saw her as unable to do that herself. And she did not see herself that way. And she did not want to die that way. And so what I had to do was forgive her for being who she was, and taking ownership and control of her own dying process, and not letting me bully her into being something she wasn't. She wasn't a victim. So that was critical for me in being able to see my part. And she had already died by the time all of this I figured this out. And so I do a living amends to her every day by not seeing other people as victims and not thinking I know better or that I can rescue them or fix them. I do this living amends every day. And that was part and parcel of step 8. And it's a really easy step to blow over. Step 9. I used to think this was a step that would repair a broken relationship so I could feel better. But now for me, this step isn't about being forgiven and getting what I want. It's about taking personal responsibility for my actions and making the other person as whole as I possibly can. This is about the other person's feelings, not mine. So you can see in, how steps 1 through 9 are all about correcting our addiction-driven distortions and misperceptions. They help me see my world differently. And this helped lower my stress levels hugely. I stopped seeing every single thing in my world as a threat. When I was the center of the universe and everything was about me, then everything was a potential threat. That's why I tried to control everything, which always led me back into the food. Trying to control the uncontrollable was a first-class ticket to Bingeville. Are there any questions on step work and stress?
At the beginning, yes, there is one question. At the beginning of this, you mentioned that most obese people have prefrontal neuron degeneration, and that's just a fact. But the question was, does prefrontal neuron regenerates if you are no longer obese? And the second part of that question is, what about the OAers that came in with a mental obsession and weren't obese? Are they affected the same way?
Okay. If they're not, I know that there's two parts here. Obese people just in general have less prefrontal cortex neurons, and there's some talk, this is getting into the weeds a little bit, but there's some talk that has to do with the high sugar content creating inflammation, which actually can create some brain damage. Okay. The killing off of cells because of inflammation. Yes, those things can regenerate. Now, for a long time, science didn't think that we could regenerate or make new brain cells, but now they know that we can. And so these things can repair themselves. I have no idea how long it takes. I don't know any of that. So obese people by themselves have less prefrontal cortex neurons, and people under acute, chronic, long-term stress, not acute, long-term chronic stress, have less frontal neurons. They don't have to be obese for that. Okay, but it just helps. I mean, it's another layer to that. I hope that answered the question.
I think it did. The second
Okay.
part, another question that came in regarding the steps, it says, is this info written down any place? The way that you describe the steps is related to science. Is it written down anywhere that we can get to that information, or do we just need to refer back to this recording?
I didn't write it down anywhere. I mean, I guess we can certainly put that down somewhere, Joy, right? I mean, we can just tack it on to that session or something on the website.
Yes, we can do that.
Okay. Okay. We can do that.
Excellent. No further questions.
Okay. All right. So now I'm going to talk about emotional sobriety work. And I'm going to go a little bit faster. Okay. Just so you know, this work, emotional sobriety work, really continues the work of recovery in the steps. And emotional sobriety was brought up as a topic by Bill W. in a Grapevine article he wrote in 1958. If you Google Bill W. emotional sobriety article, it will come up in its entirety and you can read it. It is freaking brilliant. The man was amazing. So this is where the idea of emotional sobriety came from. And I highly recommend Alan Berger's book on emotional sobriety. Surrender School actually did a book study on Alan Berger's emotional sobriety book, and it's on the website. There are videos of each of the sessions. I think it was like a 14 or 16-week session. Workshop, I can't remember. But I highly recommend that book. It was absolutely pivotal for me in my own program of recovery. Okay, so how does emotional sobriety work to further change my perceptions and help me decrease stress and cortisol? It helps me identify my false beliefs about myself and the world around me. It helps me see how emotionally dependent I am on others for how I feel about myself. And if I am dependent on others for how I feel about myself, then my self-esteem can be taken away at a moment's notice by other people. And I can get knocked off center really easily by the responses of other people to me. Doing emotional sobriety work helped me to realize that no rescuer is coming to solve all my problems. That's my job with the help of my higher power. There's no magical sponsor. There's no magical food plan. It's working the steps, working my program with my fellows and my higher power. It also helps me to see how I take things, everything, personally. Very little of what others say and do has to do with me personally. It may feel like it, but again, it's not all about me. I am not the center of the universe. You know, when you're walking into work and you say good morning to someone and they pass you right by without saying good morning back. And all of a sudden, we make it all about us. Oh my gosh, they're mad at me. Oh my gosh, what did I do? And it's not about us. They probably have something else going on. Maybe they didn't hear us. Maybe they got to served divorce papers that morning. What do you know? It's not all about us. And emotional sobriety work really helped me to see that. And it helped me to see where I was doing that in my life. Emotional sobriety work helped me accept reality for what it is. I no longer fight against reality. I may work to change the future, but I don't fight the fact of what is going on right now in this moment. I live life on life's terms to the best of my ability with the help of my higher power. Emotional sobriety work also helped me to try new things and to get creative in my problem solving instead of banging my head against the same frickin' brick wall day after day. I'm not afraid to try new things, and I am not afraid to make mistakes. That's how I learn, is by making mistakes. Emotional sobriety work also helped me to let go of the hubris and pride of perfectionism. Who am I to expect myself to be perfect? I work daily at forgiving myself and everyone else for being human. I'm constantly learning about boundaries and how to hang on to myself, my beliefs, and my values in relationships with other people. And I am also beginning to see recovery, sponsorship, and service as my higher purpose, my mission, my sacred path. It is really important in dealing with stress to have a higher purpose, a sacred mission, a sacred path. Doesn't have to be program, doesn't have to be sponsorship. It can be something else. But when we have a higher purpose that we are working towards, then difficulties and obstacles and setbacks are nothing to get all upset about. It isn't about me, it's about my higher purpose. So stress at work is no longer about how can they treat me this way? It's about getting my paycheck so I can do the things that are on my higher purpose path, like sponsoring or taking care of my grandchildren or working for social justice or whatever your higher purpose is. It really helps in mitigating stress. Are there any questions on emotional sobriety work?
No questions on emotional sobriety work at this time.
Okay. All right. The last thing I'm going to talk about is higher power connection. And this, of course, was central. I mean, it's the key to my recovery. It's what the 12 steps are all about. It's what the whole big book was written for, was to help us find a higher power that could solve our problem. I did the hard work of developing a concept of a higher power that matched how I believe the world really works, how I believe the divine really works, and how I believe these two things interact. My higher power helps me change my perceptions of things all the time. These are what I call spiritual experiences. They led to a greater spiritual awakening. My higher power does this with me through the steps because I can't do it by myself. they always talk about you can't fix a broken brain with a broken brain. I need my higher power to help me with these distortions and misperceptions and all of the wrong perceptions I had about things. I needed my higher power to help me do that because I couldn't do it by myself. And because I have little control over very little in the world, I needed a higher power I could depend on 100% of the time to help me, not to change reality, but to help me navigate it. My relationship with my higher power decreases my feelings of being helpless and a victim of circumstances. I have an ally in my life, and this decreases my stress levels most of all. I have someone I can count on. Now, are there any questions on higher power? I assume not, because that was pretty quick.
Nothing yet.
Yeah, that's all I have for today. Next session, I'm going to talk about the importance of self-care and how self-care, or the lack thereof, affects our disease. So what I'd like to do now is close it out with a serenity prayer, and then we'll open it up for questions and comments.
See you next week.